our title slide, North and Central America. And we have moved from the Eurasian African continent, where we looked at the first early civilizations. We've moved then to the New World in the Western Hemisphere. And here is our map that shows the areas that were the primary areas we're going to look at. Again, remember, we're looking at civilizations. So we're not looking at the entire continent. We're looking at the major civilizations. If you look in the green on that map, that's the area where the Mayas were in Central America. Moving farther north, the Aztecs were in the yellow region, the southern part of today's Mexico. And then the Incas were along the coast of Peru in the purple area in South America. So that's what we're going to look at today. There were early migrations to the New World from Asia. And again, remember that all the people in the world came from Africa. And so we had our Africans coming out of Africa, moving across into the area of Arabia and into Mesopotamia, across Asia, and going all the way up to the Siberia, where modern Siberia is, and crossing across into the New World. And the population, the migrants came down from the north and went down the coast of North and South America. The migrants crossed the Bering Straits from Asia on foot, chiefly of Mongoloid stock, and this happened 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, which is the date that is most commonly given, but some historians, some scholars push it as early as 35,000 to 25,000 years ago. And some modern historians think that some of these people came to the New World by boat and worked their way down North America to Central and South America. There are great variations in environment and climate in the New World, and this meant that where the people settled, there were enduring cultural differences among the first peoples. And so we have people settling in the frozen north of North America, in the tropical Amazon and Orinoco River basins, in the deserts of coastal Peru and North America. And so we have very widely differing climates. Also, there are mountain cultures in the high Andes and the Rockies, the woodlands and the prairies of North America. There have been some newer discoveries that suggest that Caucasians and Polynesians also crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, and there have been some new finds of skeletons, especially I think in the Oregon area, where the skeletons were identified as Caucasians, and they were something like 10,000 years ago. So more and more archaeological finds are suggesting that the Mongoloid people were not the only ones who crossed the Bering Strait, but that there were people who landed on both the Pacific and the Atlantic shores of North America and South America. Okay. Here are the early migrations. The newer discoveries suggest Caucasians and Polynesians. And here is a map of North America. We're going to look at North America first. The early cultures lived in small hunting bands, and they moved often. The men hunted and the women gathered. And here is a close-up of the map of North America that shows the locations of the various North American Indian tribes that lived in this area. They lived in small hunting bands and moved often, and the men hunted and the women gathered. They had a sophisticated knowledge of the natural environment, including medicinal and hallucinogenic plants. They had the technology of the new Stone Age. They had spears and spear throwers, bows and arrows. They stampeded herds of bison. Remember that there were no horses in the New World. There were virtually no animals in the New World. The only meat animals that were in the New World were turkeys and dogs. And in South America, there were llamas and alpacas. But those were domesticable. We can add that there were deer and bison that were hunted in North America. They had grinding devices and baskets and pottery. The North Americans mostly stuck to hunting and gathering, and there was a growth of settled communities that followed the development of agriculture from 5000 to 3000 BC. In the New World, corn or maize was the key staple crop on both continents. In both North and South America, corn or maize is the key crop. Now, we're not going to spend much time on the North American Indians because they lived in New Stone Age villages. They were not civilized. You can't talk about them as civilizations because we don't have civilizations in North America. But we do have different peoples who live in different areas. Here are some peoples on the East Coast, the Indians on the Northeast Coast, and in the Central Plains. We have more hunters and gatherers, the hunters of the bison. There's an article in the New York Times from May 27th, 2001, that the Indians and the bison are now coming back to the plains more and more as people give up farming and agribusiness takes over the farming. The plains farms are being abandoned, and the Indian population is up something like 20% in the counties of the Great Plains. Farmers are emptying out of that area, and Indians and bison herds are returning. As I said, the Indian population grew by 20%, while losing white population, and the native grasses and the wildflowers are returning, as are the bison herds. So that's kind of interesting that changes are going on all the time. I mentioned, here are some more of this. This is an Indian in Florida. Okay, again, these are, and here are the various, the cultures of the Indians are extremely varied. We see the teepees that are the typical housing in the Great Plains, and then we see pueblos or apartment-like dwellings in the deserts of the Southwest. Okay, here are some Indian ceremonial sand painting of the Navajos. So we have a varied culture. A number of New World crops are important to the culture that developed in the New World. The Andes region also relied on the potato. Corn or maize is common to both regions, and often you will see corn referred to in articles about the Middle East or Egypt. When the English use the word corn, what they mean is grain. If they mean corn like maize, they say maize. Okay, so maize is what's in the New World. Potatoes were the main crops in the Andes region, and they were domesticated about 1000 BC. Many varieties fit into the Andes niches, and because the Andes are mountains, as you go up the Andes, of course, the coastal region that is modern-day Chile in the Andes in South America is a desert. And as you move up the niche environments of the mountains, you have different kinds of potatoes. So there are hundreds and hundreds of kinds of potatoes. When the Europeans came and settled, they only picked a few kinds of potatoes that would grow easily in European climates and in American climates. And so many of the original potatoes were lost, but sometimes in the gourmet markets you can see them returning so that you get purple potatoes and yellow butter potatoes, and so they're trying to revive those many kinds of potato crops. Quinoa is an indigenous grain that's cultivated in the Andes, and manioc is a tuber, like a potato, cultivated in the tropical Amazon and Orinoco River basins after 1500 BC. All squash is native to the New World, and local seed crops in North America along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The other crops that are native to the New World are tomatoes, avocados, cacao or chocolate beans, chili peppers, and peppers of all kinds are native to the New World. And these are the crops that the civilizations of the New World are built around. They're quite different from the crops of the Old World that we've looked at before. Another one is amaranth, which is a flowering plant, and some of these are available today. There are common features of the early American civilizations. There are technologies, beliefs, and ritual practices that they all share in common, whether they're in North America or South America. And here we can see what we're going to look at in our lecture today is North America, including Central America. And so all of these civilizations in the American civilizations have common features, technologies, beliefs, and ritual practices that are exchanged on the long-distance trade routes. Religious beliefs, techniques, and decorative styles are shared in common. They accepted that the gods had dual or male-female natures. None of the New World cultures developed the concept of the state to any extent. And all the cultures in the New World, all the civilizations are based on kinship groups, clans, tribes, and federations. A form of kingship melded the religious and the secular powers together. Kings, priests, and shamans were assumed to transform themselves into supernatural beings. And through bloodletting rituals and the use of hallucinogenic substances, men communicated with gods. Images of men were transformed into jaguars as a common decorative motif. So all of these elements I've just named are what all the cultures in the New World have in common. They share these common cultures. Okay, we can add a little bit more to that. Here are some of the regions of the New World. The deserts, whether they're of central Mexico or of central United States, and the desert culture again. The Central Valley of Mexico, which is in the mountains, and that's the region where the Aztec civilization grew. So we have these varied climates, the tropical lowlands, which are in Guatemala and the region of Central America. And here are some actual photographs of the shores of Central America and Guatemala. Two of my former students took these pictures in this region. And so these are all the regions that the American civilizations grew in. Warfare and the sacrifice of prisoners was tied to ritual needs, and all of these cultures shared the sacrifice of prisoners. They believed that bloodletting was central to survival, and they all practiced human sacrifice to a greater or lesser extent. In the region of Central America, they developed monumental sculpture, a number system based on 20, and ritual and solar calendars. In the civilizations of the South, there is similar urban planning, and the cities that developed civilizations were dominated by temple pyramids, ball courts, and the homes of the elites. In all of these cultures, there's a universal and deeply rooted belief that the land belonged to the community as a whole and that it should be worked for the common good. There is no individual ownership or crops for profit. So now we've run through all the similarities in the American civilizations. Okay. In Mexico, in the Central Valley and the highlands of Guatemala and the Andes, superior cultures developed, and these are the civilizations. These are the areas where civilization developed. In Mexico, in the Central Valley, in Guatemala, in the highlands, and Peru, in the Andes mountains. All have the characteristics of higher civilizations, but few of them have historical records. And so there are few historical records that survive for the Mayans and for the Aztecs, possibly for the Incas. That some new research is showing that the Incas might have had a written language, but it's very difficult and we can't translate it. So virtually everything we look at here is archaeological. All of our sources are archaeological. There are just a very few written texts. The geography, there is great geographic and climatic diversity, as we said, and we're going to look at some of these. And in all of these areas, there are microenvironments with ecological niches. The weapons, and especially the weapons, knives, are made of obsidian, which is lava glass, and chert, which is quartz. The Olmecs were the first of the Central American civilizations to develop, and they developed on the coast of Mexico to Guatemala, and they are very much like the Sumerians in the Mesopotamian River Valley. They are the core culture. They are the first culture that develops, and they are the first culture that develops certain characteristics. We know mostly about them from archaeological evidence, but that evidence suggests endemic warfare, that they were constantly at war. The Olmecs were the first advanced civilization, and they began about 1200 to 400 BC on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, south of Veracruz, to Guatemala. And here we have a map. And essentially this area that's green on this map is the area where the Olmecs developed. They probably laid the foundation for all the successors of civilizations in Mesoamerica. They worshipped a divinity that was half man and half jaguar, and the principal monuments are colossal basalt heads like this one that I'm showing you. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures from an archaeological dig that was made in 1850, and of course they had no photographs then, so that these are all drawings and engravings that are in this set of books that document this excavation. They made extensive use of raised fields and drainage canals. In other words, they built up their fields by piling dirt on them and then surrounding them with drainage canals, and that's how they developed their farming technology. Their greatest artistic achievement was in jade carving, and we see a number of figurines and necklaces and ceremonial knives among the Olmecs. They probably had a powerful political class that commanded thousands of laborers, but this is just a guess. I mean, we have to guess who made those raised fields and what was the labor that made them. And so, you know, when you're dealing with archaeological evidence, a lot of it is guesswork, because a lot of it you have actual evidence for what happened, but you have to kind of put it together and try to guess how they actually managed some of these things. So, so again, some of these facts can change over time. Among the Olmecs, though, we know that skilled craftsmen worked in stone and clay, and these basalt heads are evidence of that. They also had a class of shamans or priests, and they had a merchant class, because we can see evidence of objects from both the North America and South America that are found in this area. So they practiced trade, and there were trade routes linking North and South America together. The Olmecs played a crucial role in the early development of writing and astronomy. They were very good astronomers. They viewed the sun, moon, and stars, and they looked at the movements of the heaven, probably related to their religion. The Olmecs invented the ball characteristic, the characteristic ball game that they had, and later the ball game would develop, but they were the ones who invented it. So this is the core culture. Like the Sumerians in the Mesopotamian River Valley, this culture was the beginning. Here is an aerial view of the ball court taken from the massive Calcocan pyramid at Chichen Itza, which is much later, of course, but the ball court became a very important element. And here is the ball court again as it developed later. So, but this is an element that you find in all the cultures of this area. Here's a close-up of the bas-relief at the ball court in Chichen Itza, and again, this is later that it developed. But the bare beginnings were in the area of the Olmecs. This is a sacrificial pool where I'm told that virgins were sacrificed to the gods. Now, I've mentioned before that virtually all the cultures we've looked at practice human sacrifice. All the American cultures practiced it to a greater or lesser extent, sometimes much greater extent. But here's a human sacrifice. And here are the cities. Okay, remember we talked about whether civilization has to be tied to cities, and we saw that in Sumeria it was indeed tied to the formation of cities. The first civilizations in Sumeria were city-states, but in Egypt they were not. People didn't live in cities in Egypt, but we still have a civilization there. In Central America, again, we have civilization developing in cities, the growth of cities. The next civilization that developed after the Olmecs faded out, and growing out of it was the Teotihuacan Civilization, which began around 300 BC. The height of their power was 450 to 600 AD, so they lasted almost 1,000 years. So this should be 300 BC to 700 AD. And it existed in an area close to present-day Mexico City. Teotihuacan was the largest city in America, and it was religion-based and with a rigid theocracy that contributed largely to the religious heritage. They built huge stone pyramids, larger than in Egypt, but of smaller stones. The Egyptians built their pyramids of huge stones. These are smaller stones. And the Teotihuacan culture covered the pyramids with stucco and decorations. They were not tombs like the Egyptian pyramids, but they were temples. And they were covered with carvings and colored frescoes that were magnificent. Among the gods were the sun, moon, and a storm god. And in Teotihuacan, we see the introduction of the worship of a plumed serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, which became the universal cult in Mesoamerica. So Quetzalcoatl is the main god that we're going to look at. He was believed to be the originator of agriculture and the arts. And we're going to see a picture of him in a minute. I want to go through these notes first. Like the Olmecs, Teotihuacan practiced human sacrifice, which was viewed as a sacred duty toward the gods, that this was the way the universe was kept going by repeated human sacrifice. Also, like the Olmecs, they practiced agriculture, organized agriculture, and they drained the swamps in the region around Mexico City, and they developed irrigation, and they built irrigation works into the hillsides. The device they used to develop this agriculture is chinampas, which are floating gardens, narrow artificial islands that were floated on the lakes, and there they anchored them by trees, and they were able to practice year-round agriculture. And as a result of these technological innovations of irrigation and the building of chinampas, they experienced huge population growth, and they lived in apartment-like stone housing. They developed the arts of civilization, where craftsmen produced pottery and stone tools, and they practiced long-distance trade in obsidian tools and pottery. An elite appears to have controlled the state bureaucracy, collecting the taxes and regulating the commerce. From the archaeological remains, there seems to have been growing class distinction in dress and diet, so that you can look at different parts of the city and see what clothing they wore and what sort of diet they ate, and distinguish the classes. We can tell from the archaeological remains that the aristocracy lived in better houses and that they were separate from the lower classes. There was great prestige of the priestly class and an absence of defensive structures that suggest that there was peace in the Mexican Valley, but a powerful military protected the trade. Toward the end of this time, around 700 AD, there was a period of population decline and internal conflict, possibly mismanagement of resources beginning about 650 AD. And in 700 AD, they were conquered by invaders, the Cholula of the Valley of Pueblo, who were nomadic warriors from the north. So this is a pattern that we're going to see in the Mexican Valley, that nomads from the north are going to repeatedly conquer it. You have a question? Yeah.
Are they the Pueblo from Crow Canyon, Colorado?
They come from that same region, but it's from the region of Puebla, but they're not Puebla Indians necessarily. I mean, we don't know who they were, but they came from the north, and they came from that region of Puebla, of the Cholula Valley. Okay, let's look at some of their artifacts. Here is the region where they were. This orange region is the region where Teotihuacan was developed. And here are the pyramids, the kinds of pyramids that they built. Again, they're taller than the Egyptian pyramids, and they're covered with stucco. And here are some charts. And again, I'm showing you these drawings from the archaeological excavations of 1850. Here we see Quetzalcoatl, the serpent god. You see him down at the bottom of this stela here. And here's the kind of pottery that is developed in this region. Okay. They were then followed by the Toltecs. Okay. The Toltecs arose. They were first, the Cholula Indians wiped out Teotihuacan, and the Toltecs then entered the region 200 years later. By 950 AD, the Toltecs had established a center at Tula and expanded southward and eastward, and this is again in that Mexican Valley region. They then moved far southward from Mexico and occupied Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula, and the Toltecs were very important as transmitters of culture. They had a warrior aristocracy, and they absorbed the Teotihuacan culture, again practicing human sacrifice. The original contribution was developed the ball game into a game played on a court, which then spread throughout Mesoamerica. So the Toltecs developed the court for the ball game, and this spread throughout the whole of Mesoamerica. And here in the orange area, you can see Tula, the main city of the Toltecs, again in that orange region, and then they spread southward into Central America. Okay, and here is that ball court again, the development of the court for the ball game, and they, as far as I've read, there's speculation that probably what they did was to take their prisoners of war, and the prisoners of war played the ball game, and the losers died. and so again, it was part of the human sacrifice that they practiced to have these ritual ball games. Here again is, yeah, question.
So it was something similar to like the Roman gladiators, the Colosseum type of thing, where they would have different prisoners duke it out, and the winner wins, loser dies type of thing?
Yes, it's kind of, I mean, you could draw a parallel with the Romans. The Romans did something similar with if you think of it as a sport, but this is a ball game. They didn't. The Romans were very inventive about what they did. They not only had people fight each other, they had them fight beasts in the arena. Sometimes they flooded it and had naval battles. They were much more inventive. In Central America, in the ball courts, they did the same thing over and over again. I mean, they didn't try to elaborate into inventive new games. Here is Quetzalcoatl. I did a close-up of him, who is the god that they adopted from the essentially from the earlier culture, and they embellished the Quetzalcoatl cult. He was now identified as a culture bearer and a teacher. They told a story about him being driven from Tula by a rival god, and after much wandering, Quetzalcoatl burned himself to death, and his flaming heart became the planet Venus. Other legends developed about Quetzalcoatl, legends that he had created mankind out of the bones snatched from the Lord of the Dead Land. And with this new religion, or it's not a new religion, it's an old religion that they've developed, the Toltecs then created a powerful conquest state. They were a military state, and they were engaged in conquest, extending their influence from North to Central America. As we said, Tula was the Toltec capital, and they were much more warlike and violent than their predecessors. And once again, they practiced human sacrifice. Interestingly, the Toltecs were ruled by two chieftains or king at the same time, and this led to rivalry between the two kings and civil war. But again, by 1168 AD, they were overcome by another wave of northern invaders. Okay, so here we have the Toltecs, and here is their city of Tula, which you can see is the farthest north of these cities on the map, and spreading into Central America. Now we're going to move into the southern region of Guatemala and Central America and look at the Mayas of Mexico and Guatemala. And they were the ones who probably reached the highest intellectual development of all of the American, North American and Central American cultures. The Mayans began about 600 BC, and they arose in the modern areas of Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and southern Mexico. And you can see the original, the place where they were the most prominent is this pink area on our map that we can see here. This area had a tropical climate, and it developed with rival city-states, and they fought each other. They were often in constant warfare. And again, this reminds us of what was going on in the Sumerian culture among the rival city-states. Because there was a tropical climate, they had fragile soils, and tropical soils are very thin and they're hard to maintain the fertility. And because the environment was so difficult, the Mayan city-states never unified politically, and the rival kingdoms fought for dominance. Again, they were characterized by rival city-states like the Sumerian city-states, but also like the Greek city-states, which we'll talk about next week. This is another area where we have city-states grow that fight each other. The cities were political and ceremonial centers positioned to reflect the movement of the sun and Venus. So they had a very good knowledge of astronomy. Most of the cities had open plazas, and they had pyramids like the Olmecs. Again, they were building on the cultures that came before them. They had elaborately decorated palaces, and I'm going to show you some of those in a moment. The Mayans loved decoration, and the bas-relief was painted in bright colors. They were most indebted to the Olmecs for the foundation of their culture, and they followed the same migration route south as the Olmecs had. About 1 AD, they reached the Guatemalan highlands, and here the culture reached its peak from 300 to 900 AD, and there they spread to the Yucatan Peninsula. And then, in the Yucatan Peninsula, it rose to another high point in the 11th and 12th centuries AD. Because this second height of culture was a result of fusion with the Toltec elements. By 950 AD, the Toltecs had occupied Chichen Itza, and this spurred it on to new developments and new cultural blossoming. The city remained a brilliant center of worship and ceremonial display, artistic production, but by the time the Spanish arrived in the 15th century, it had lost its vigor. Okay, so we see the fusion with the Toltecs. Let's take a look at this. Here is the city of Chichen Itza, which is the high point of the Mayan culture. And here we see the view of the ruins of the city from the top of the pyramid. Okay, and here we see again the city of Tulum. And again, some buildings in Tulum, the buildings of the city. Okay, there's evidence of urban sprawl in excavations that were done in around 2000 at the end of the 20th century. New excavations were done in the city of Caracol in Belize, which was also a Mayan city. And what they found was a central core of the city with a plaza in the pyramid in the central core and a sort of ring around it of what you might call an industrial area where poor people lived in some form of poverty, a manufacturing zone. And then outside of that, a ring of prosperous houses, a kind of suburban zone. And they even conjectured that there were shopping malls out there in the suburbs, but I don't know. I'm wondering how much imagination there is. But farther out there were substantial suburbs and strip malls of antiquity. And so this is some of the latest excavations of the Mayan ruins. And here again we see this area of the Yucatan down into Honduras and Belize and the principal cities of the Mayan culture. Civilization rested on agriculture, but it remained primitive. And here are some people. Here is a bas-relief of the people and their artistic production. Civilization rested on culture but remained primitive. They had no draft animals and no domesticated animals at all, and they didn't have the wheel. Okay, the wheel did not exist in North and South America at all. The animals that they had, the only domesticated animals they had were dogs and fowls, and this is largely turkeys. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, supplemented by draining the swamps and building elevated fields like the Olmecs. And again, this original technology was characteristic of each successive culture. They also terraced hillsides on the cooler highlands, and so they terraced the hillsides, irrigating them. Every home had a garden, and they grew fruits and vegetables in their houses. They also carefully managed the nearby forests, favoring the growth of trees and shrubs and the conservation of animals. Most people lived in miserable thatched or reed huts, but their artistry was shown in the wall frescoes, stone sculptures, and wood carvings, and the polychrome pottery and textiles. So let's take a look at some of those. Here we see these wall carvings which show what the people looked like and what they wore. And here are some textiles. These are modern Guatemalan textiles, but they're done in the traditional manner. And this is actually, a reproduction of the writing that they had, the hieroglyphs that they had, but you can see the bright colors that they're done in. We'll see the hieroglyphs in a moment. And here is the region where the cities were. They had an idea of the cosmos. They had an idea of heaven and hell and the earth. And the Mayan cosmos was divided into 3 layers connected along a vertical axis that traced the course of the sun. So they envisioned reality as being on 3 levels, that there's a heaven, and there's an earth that we all live on, and there's an underworld. Earthly human existence is between a heaven and an underworld. And the heaven is a sky monster, and the underworld is dark. A sacred tree rose through the 3 layers with roots in the underworld and branches in heaven. And so this is how they envisioned the structure of the universe. The pyramids were sacred mountains reaching to the heaven. And here we have a very good pyramid here. This is the one, the massive Teotihuacan pyramid in Chichen Itza. They were sacred mountains reaching to the heavens, and the doorways were portals to the underworld. The rulers and elites served both priestly and political functions, and they decorated their bodies with paint and tattoos. They wore elaborate costumes of animal skins and feathers, and that represented their secular power, but they were also divine. The rulers communicated with other worlds through bloodletting rituals and hallucinogenic trances. Okay, bloodletting rituals could take all kinds of forms, whether it's just cutting yourself or actual human sacrifice to tearing living hearts out of the chests of victims. And so they practiced sacrifice in very many different ways. Even the battles were infused with religious meaning and elaborate ritual. And when the prisoners of war were taken, they were tortured and they were sacrificed. Frequently, wars were fought between the various cities to secure captives rather than territory. They needed captives for their human sacrifice. And the battles were preceded by days of fasting and sacred ritual and rites of purification. So battles took on a sacred character. And so here you can see this great pyramid at Chichen Itza, which is representative of the pyramids in the center of all these cities. And here you can see the Quetzalcoatl head at the base of the stairs of the sacred temple. And here is, well, this is called a nunnery. It's just a building. We don't know if it was a nunnery or not. It's called a nunnery, but I don't know if it was. And here we see the carvings that are on the sides of the pyramids decorating the city, the kind of decoration they had. This is the plan of Copan, the plan of the city of Copan, with the trees and the plaza in the center and the pyramid in it with the river going through it. And here you can see the view of the ruins and the plan of the ruins. Again, this is from this archaeological text. And here we see the top of the pyramid with a temple on the top of it. It's slightly different from the one at Chichen Itza. Okay. Again, these are drawings at the first excavation of Copan. Yeah.
Where did we say the pyramid at Chichen Itza was at? Where was that at exactly?
It's in Chichen Itza. It's one of the cities in the northern region of Yucatan. Copan is to the south of Chichen Itza. It's a southern city. We'll see the map in a moment. And here is a portrait of one of these rulers. This is what the rulers look like. And again, these are the reliefs. And remember, they're brightly painted, bright colors. And you see them wearing feather headdresses, feathers and furs. And these are probably scribes that are sitting at his feet. I'll tell you more about the scribes in just a moment. But here we have the rulers. Again, here is Copan, and here is the pyramid with a temple on top of it, and this palace below. The palace is below the pyramid and the temple. And here is a plan of a large stone building in Uxmal, which is another of these cities. And again, here is an inner apartment and a temple to the north. And again, these people, the bas-reliefs of the priests and the rulers who lived in the city. There are stelas like this throughout the city, and you can see they have written words all over them. And it's only been in recent time that we can actually interpret the language. People have only learned to read it quite recently. And you had a reading from one of the interpretations in your readings for today, which was the creation according to the Mayas. Did you all read that? What did you think of it? What did you think of anybody have any comments about it? All the original men were made out of wood, and they had no souls. And the gods didn't like them because they had no souls, and so they sent down a great flood to destroy them all. And then the animals hated them because they never fed the animals, so the animals attacked them, and the fires attacked them, and the cooking pots attacked them. Buried in the middle of that story was a kind of outcome of it. Quickly, it said that the men were all made of wood, and they were kind of softened by creating women of rushes. And then that implied that there was a new race of people that replaced the old wooden people. But then the story returned to telling about, how the animals and the pots and the pans and the fire destroyed the wooden men because they were so displeasing to them. I thought it was a very strange creation story. It was difficult to interpret. But this is the writing on these stelas in the middle of the cities. Okay, and here we see a figure in one of these large, gigantic figures, which are very characteristic of the figures in the cities. And here again are the stelas with the written messages on them that we haven't all interpreted. And again, it's all in a tropical landscape. And so in many places, when we go into these cities to excavate them, they've been taken over by the vegetation in the region. Okay, and here are some pottery figures, whether they're gods or toys for children, we don't know. They're just figures that have been found. Whether they're portraits, they seem to be jointed at the knees and the elbows. But we don't know what they are. We've just found them. Here's some of the pottery that they produced. Here are more of the pyramids with the decoration on the pyramids and a floor plan of the pyramid with a temple on top. And here you can see Again, another pyramid, very overgrown by the vegetation. This one has a palace on top. And here is a close-up of that palace that's very richly decorated with huge works of art and huge pictures on the facade of it. And this is taken from a little bit farther away so you can get an idea of the building. Okay. And here is the floor plan of that building. It's a huge palace. It's gigantic, and you can see all the rooms in it. It's quite a remarkable edifice. It's a remarkable piece of building that worthy of a civilization. Here you can see the outside of it, again with the tropical jungle around it, and one of the gigantic heads. And these probably are kings. Here is a series of what the kings looked like seated on the jaguar throne, and you can see that jaguar throne and being served by servants. That looks like that servant is holding skulls in his hand. And again, the whole culture is permeated by human sacrifice. And here is another king, you can see, with his feathered headdress and elaborate costume that he wears. And here is another one smoking probably a hallucinogenic substance with a kind of pipe here, again in a ritual clothing. Interestingly, women played an important political and religious role, and two women are known to have ruled the Mayan kingdoms. Cananoical ruled Palenque from 583 to 604 AD, and Sakuk ruled Palenque from 612 to 615 AD. And as we said, women could be rulers. Here we see a woman in this stela, and they played important political and religious roles in the bloodletting and other public ceremonies. But Mayan society was usually patrilineal, although sometimes it could be bilateral, so that people could inherit through either the man or the woman. The whole society excelled in mathematics and astronomy, and they kept accurate chronological records on stone calendar pillars. Okay. The Mayan calendar, we have been able to interpret the Mayan calendar. It was a remarkable invention. The Toltec has used a solar calendar with a 365-day year, but the Mayans went beyond the solar calendar in complexity, sophistication, and mathematical symmetry. They had a ritual cycle of 260 days divided into 13 months of 20 days. Okay, so that's one ritual cycle of 260 days. Parallel to that was a solar cycle based on the sun with 365 days, and that cycle had 18 months of 20 days, plus 5 bad days at the end of the year. And by bad days, those are days when bad things happen to you on those 5 days. The concurrence of these two calendars every 52 years was believed to be especially ominous. So they ran these two cycles side by side, and when they came together on the same date, that was a day of extreme bad luck, a really bad day. They maintained another calendar of events, a continuous long count calendar. And the Mayans were fascinated with the phenomenon of time. They correlated celestial time, the time of the heavens and the stars in the heavens. They correlated it to terrestrial time, or the changing of the seasons on the earth. And this Mayan calendar was far more accurate than the European calendars that were kept at the same time, which would be the Julian calendar of the Romans before the Gregorian calendar of 1582. This calendar was also a library of information, because surrounding it were stories of traditional rituals, mythology, history, seasonal and astronomical data. The calendar itself started from an arbitrary fixed date, which was August 10th, 313 BC, which must have been the day of creation. That's when the calendar begins, August 10th, 313 BC. The Mayans could determine any day in any year, forward or backward from the base of that year, and each calendrical inscription named the exact day or night of an event. And so they had a historical record. They correlated with each event with planetary phases, the age of the moon, eclipses, or other events. And they could record data by a system of place notation, okay? They had writing, as we've already seen some of their writing, but they used the concept of 0, and they used it with units of 20. They assigned a particular value to each space on a column of figures like an abacus, and so they had the concept of the 0. Okay, here is that writing, and here you see the calendar surrounded with the history of events, because on the left you see the text of the writing, and on the right you see pictures illustrating the history that they're telling about in the writing. Okay, the data was recorded again through place notation, and we have the concept of 0. They developed a writing system, evolving it from the calendar, and this was their crowning achievement. Okay. They gradually expanded the calendrical statements and learned to depict the parts of speech. This writing system was pictographic in origin. It was like Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was also like the Chinese character that was pictographic. The Mayan language had 600 characters, about 10% representing spoken sounds. That is, 60 of them represent spoken sounds rather than words. And it might have eventually developed into a true alphabet of sounds from these phonetics if their culture had endured. They also produced illuminated books written on deerskin and paper made from the maguey plant. And when the Spanish came and found them, the Spanish burned them because they were pagan books. And so we don't know what those books said. The script has not yet been fully deciphered, although they've deciphered some of it. Only the Maya of all the American cultures produced a written literature that has survived, and Mayan signs represent sounds or whole words. For example, balam is the word for jaguar, and there's a symbol for that. Prefixes and suffixes could be added to form other words. Okay, so let's see a little more of their writing. Here you can see a close-up of the writing system, so that each one of these characters can be a word or a sound or a pictogram. Okay, and here we can see it again, another portrayal of it with another notation at the bottom. It makes me think of glossing, that you have a main text and then you have a comment about it on the side here. The scribes handled public relations for the Maya rulers. The scribes who wrote were very, very powerful. They were the main servants of the rulers, but defeat of the Maya rulers meant disasters. All the royal courts in all the cities had scribes of very high ranks, and the chief scribe was the keeper of the royal library. And this again is according to an article in the New York Times from July 2001. When times were good, not God, but good, the scribes lived well, and when the kings were defeated, the scribes suffered a cruel fate. They weren't actually killed, but when one city or one tribe conquered another one, the scribes were tortured and their fingers were mutilated so that they could no longer tell the story of the king that they served. And then they died by the conqueror's sword. So this is one of the latest archaeological finds in that region. Again, watch the science section of the New York Times that comes out on Tuesday. A lot of these things will come out in that. And here we see an altar of sacrifice. Again, human sacrifice was practiced by all of them. Religious was of overwhelming importance. The temple-crowned pyramids were the centers of dense populations where sacred rites were performed, and these included human sacrifices. The chief gods were the spirits of the forest and the sky. For example, the planet Venus was Lord Big Eye, and the rain god was very important. And here we have one of these sacrificial altars. Human sacrifices were offered to the rain god, typically by throwing virgins into a well, and we already saw the virgins. Here is a sacrifice. Here is a priest sacrificing a man. He's got his knife to practice a human sacrifice, throwing virgins into the well. The plumed or feathered serpent deity Teotihuacan, which is a new manifestation of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, was highly venerated as the god of the sky and the thunder. And Teotihuacan was the Mayan equivalent to the Toltec and Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, as I said. According to the Mayan legend, Teotihuacan once lived on earth as a man, and he is a feathered serpent, the god of sky and thunder. He once lived on earth as a man. He had taught their ancestors the arts of civilization, and he would one day return to save them. So we've gone through the Aztecs, and we've gone through the Mayans, and we've looked at their culture. Now let's move farther to the north and look at the Aztecs, the last of the indigenous American cultures of Mexico, which dominated the Central Valley while the Maya declined. And I also want to mention to you another news article that I didn't have time to put into this. And I don't have a date for it, but the headline for this article is, "Don't Blame Columbus for All the Indians' Ills." And what archaeologists found was signs of anemia can be seen in the eye orbit and in the pits on top of the skull. They can find signs of anemia in all of the Indians of the New World. In examining the skeletal evidence, paleopathologists rate the healthiest pre-Columbians to be people living 1,200 years ago on the coast of Brazil, where they had access to ample food from land and sea, okay, and they were protected from disease by being isolated. Conditions also must have been good along the coasts of South Carolina and Southern California and in the Midwest. The least healthy people in the study were from the urban cultures of Mexico and Central America, notably where the Maya civilization flourished, presumably at great cost to life and limb. Okay, so the Mayans were the least healthy. Remember, the soils were very fragile and thin and not very healthy. Their diet was not very good. They are racked by malnutrition, which is what this article is about. So before Columbus came, the Americans were suffering from terrible malnutrition. Okay, let's turn to the Aztecs. The Aztecs conquered in 1325 AD. They were related to the Toltecs, and like them, they had migrated southward. They came from the northern regions into the central Mexican valley. In Mexico, they conquered the tribes they encountered, and the Aztecs were also known as the Mexica. At first, they served their more powerful neighbors as serfs and mercenary. In 1325 AD, they established their headquarters on the site of modern-day Mexico City, the city of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, which were twin cities founded by the Aztecs. And they were founded on the chinampas of the Toltecs, the floating gardens that still were the center of those two cities. They became valued mercenaries of the dominant Azcapotzalco power. But the military successes allowed the Aztecs to seize control of more lands along the shore of Lake Texcoco. And they transformed their political system by introducing a monarchical system of a kingship ruling that was created by and was the focal center for 20 federated tribes. They had a system of personal relationships and landholding, sometimes compared to feudalism, because they were granted lands in return for loyalty to their tribal leaders. Feudalism is something that is very much argued about by scholars, and maybe there's a rough parallel to feudalism, but I don't think you can call it anything like the medieval feudalism. Nevertheless, they had those personal relationships between land-holding followers and ruling classes. Class distinctions became ever more important. There was a warrior elite and a peasant labor class, and there were slaves, and slaves, of course, were the conquered people. The elite were set apart by their diet, dress, jewelry, and houses. They lived at a high altitude, 7,000 feet, in central Mexico, where the climate was moderate, and they had a rich agricultural hinterland, an ideal location, which was the Valley of Mexico. Okay, and here we see a Mexican valley in the highlands of Mexico, and again in a more tropical area of that region as you go down the mountainside. The city was situated on marshy ground, and it was improved by constructing dikes and causeways and canals. The streets were paved with stone and kept scrupulously clean by Public Works Department. And we know much more about the Aztec cities. Do you know why we know more about the Aztec cities? Because when the Spanish came, they wrote descriptions of them. And so we know a lot more about, for example, Tenochtitlan than we do about some of the Mayan cities. There were 3 causeways that connected the city to the lake shore, and fresh water was supplied by an aqueduct. When the Spanish came, they had a population of 200,000 people. A specialized class of merchants controlled the long-distance trade, and the items that were traded along the long-distance trade routes were gold and jewels, as some of the gold you can see here in this illustration, feathered garments, chocolate, animal skins, and this supplied the military and the political intelligence for the elites from the trade routes. Okay. Merchant expeditions were armed and had to defend themselves, and trade was carried out by barter. There was no money at all in any part of the New World. There was no concept of money, but they traded just for barter. The Aztec culture was a synthesis of elements derived from the others, and once again, it is built on all the cultures we've already looked at, from the Olmecs through the Mayans through the Toltecs. The Aztecs adopted all those elements. They had a crude form of picture writing. The Aztecs produced some written books. Few have survived. Again, the Spanish burned a lot of those books, but some did survive. We do have some in the language of Nahuatl that still survive to this day. And you have one of your readings, 2 of your readings are done in Nahuatl, which is a history of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. Yeah, press your mic.
I think what you're talking about right there, it was talking from the Aztec point of view of how the Spanish conquered them. And it was talking about a disease that a lot of the Aztecs got as far as like sores, whatnot. Was that like smallpox or something? Or?
Probably. It could have been smallpox, it could have been chickenpox. All of those diseases ran rampant. But remember that we had this article, this archaeological dig that shows that the populations in America were not very healthy to begin with. So they were very susceptible to these diseases because they weren't very helpful. I can't remember the name, the author of the book, Jared Diamond, I think is his name, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steels. And one of the arguments he makes in that book is that the reason that European and Asian populations, and this would be Europe, Asia, part of Africa, all of that area in the Middle East that we've been studying so far, that the reason they're so resistant to diseases is because they have so many animals in their culture, that the exposure to animals and the bacteria and the germs of animals has made Eurasians very resistant. And so they were resistant to diseases. When they came to the New World people were not, because they didn't have very many animals in the New World, and people didn't live around animals. And then this other article says they were already not very healthy to begin with. And so all of that had something to do with, and don't think of the Europeans as, maliciously poisoning the New World people. They had no idea that the New World people would not be resistant to their germs. They had no idea. So there was never any intent to kill off people in the New World. It was an accident, there's something that happened. Well, here we have the Aztecs. Let's get through with them for a minute. The Aztecs adopted the Toltec calendar, and of course the calendar was a feature of every one of these cultures because they share many of the same features. Here's the Aztec calendar stone. It weighed 20 tons. It originally stood in front of the Temple of the Sun in Tenochtitlan and served as an altar for human sacrifice. And here we see the top of that calendar. I'm going to show you the side of it in a moment, but they sacrificed victims on this calendar. This is represented on the calendar stone itself. It presents a mythical history of the world with 4 cycles of creation and catastrophe in it. Aztec craftsmen were skilled workers in copper, gold and silver, stone and shell mosaic. They also continue the practice of pyramid building and terracing the sides. The great temple pyramid of Tenochtitlan was surrounded by high walls decorated with sculptured serpents. It's now disappeared. It's gone. But the base of the pyramid serves as the main square of modern Mexico City. So the Spanish tore that pyramid down. The Aztecs basically were a society of warriors, but they possessed artistic talent and engineering skill. Every man was either a soldier or a priest, and they fought continually and were very cruel to the vanquished. And here we see the calendar stone, which was an altar of sacrifice, and here you can see it, another altar of sacrifice that was used for human sacrificing. Harsh punishments were done to transgressors within their own society, and the Aztec religion had an accent on violence. The benevolent serpent god Quetzalcoatl was subordinate to the sun god and the war god, and the Aztecs made human sacrifice the basis of their religion. They waged frequent wars to capture prisoners for sacrifice, and there were huge numbers of victims. They also created a new cult, a cult of Huitzilopochtli. I'm sorry I didn't write this down for you, but the hummingbird cult that was associated with the sun. And the hummingbird god was believed to require a diet of human hearts to sustain him in his daily course across the sky. The hummingbird is the sun who needs a diet of human hearts. Tlaloc, the rain god, was his twin power. And I believe this is Tlaloc. I'm not sure, but I think this is an image of Tlaloc. It's a very large Aztec god. Tlaloc was the rain god, was the twin power of the hummingbird god, which was the sun. And the twin pyramids of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god, the twin pyramids dominated Tenochtitlan. War captives were preferred as the victims of sacrifice, and criminals, slaves, and people captured, people given in tribute to the conquering Aztecs were sacrificed. The numbers of sacrifices by the Aztecs numbered into the thousands, and some scholars estimate as many as 20,000 people a year were sacrificed by the Aztecs for political reasons as well as religious reasons. So they had this huge population of 200,000 people, but they were sacrificing 20,000 people a year. So we've looked at the development of the cultures of the New World, starting with the New Stone Age cultures of North America, the Indian tribes as we call them, and the civilizations in the south in the regions of the Mexico City Valley and the area of the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America and Guatemala. We have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions, comments. Yeah, use your mic.
I don't have a question, but last time you asked what Chinese year this was. It's the year of the pig.
It's the year of the pig. Okay, thank you. I meant to look that up, and of course I forgot. Okay, so this is the year of the pig. Well, any questions or comments about anything we've done? Okay. Yes, question.
In that movie Apocalypto by Mel Gibson, it showed there's a connection between the eclipse of the sun and the sacrifices.
Yes.
And, I mean, can you explain that, what that is about?
I can't explain it. I can't explain what it is. I think he's probably right about that. The hummingbird god was the sun god. And so any event in the skies, and they were very cognizant of the astronomical events, of the events in the heavens, which had great meaning for them. So I think I haven't seen that movie, but I think he's probably right about that. I've read some reviews of it, and it sounds pretty bloodthirsty. But the Aztecs, I mean, all of these American cultures were really, really engaged in human sacrifice, and the Aztecs were the worst of the whole group. And I say worst because I think human sacrifice is a bad thing. But the Aztecs did more of it than any of the others, but all of them practiced human sacrifice. Why? I don't know. There's another culture, if you're interested in the fact of human sacrifice. As we go through all these cultures, we saw the Chinese did it, the Sumerians did it, everybody practiced, the Egyptians did it. Everybody practiced human sacrifice at some time or another. Some were more bloodthirsty than others. The Aztecs are probably the worst. There's a parallel culture that we're going to come across as we get into the Greek and Roman times, and that is the Phoenicians who lived in Carthage, the Carthaginians. They also, I guess I didn't mention here, but the Olmecs practiced a particularly heinous kind of human sacrifice. They sacrificed babies. And the Carthaginians also did that same thing. They made a practice of systematically sacrificing babies. And so those are the only two cultures I know of that sacrifice babies. But it seems to be part of human nature. I don't know why. That you find every single culture practicing human sacrifice at some time or another. Sad fact of human nature. Yeah, question?
Couldn't it be practical purposes as well? I mean, you said the soil was bad. Cutting down the population like that would surely help them.
It could. It could. This wouldn't be true of the Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico, which is very fertile. It would be true in the Mayan cultures, and the Mayans were not as bloodthirsty as the Aztecs, but the Mayan cultures got sick. I mean, their bones deteriorated. They died of malnutrition, and by the time the Spanish came, they were in serious declines, and a lot of the cities were reverting to wilderness. And the Mayans, they were declining naturally by the time the Spanish came from illness. But certainly this is true, and the old Stone Age cultures did practice limitation of their population. We don't know if some of them used human sacrifice, some of them used cannibalism. For example, the Stone Age cultures in New Guinea still to this day practice cannibalism. And so why they do it, I don't know. I mean, they've just had that custom for hundreds of years. It could be population control. But it doesn't seem to be true in the Valley of Mexico. They didn't need to limit their population. It had something to do with their competitive warfare societies because they were engaged in constant warfare. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then let's take a break of maybe about 15 minutes, and we'll move farther south, and we'll look at, I think that's the last one, yeah, and we'll look at South America and the Incas and see what they did.